All right, give me 1 second here while I light up the. Ooh, I don't want to end that. I want to start and I want to hit go live over here. So we're waiting on. There we go. So StreamYard is live, as is Instagram. And so tonight we're going to talk about genetics and epigenetics. And I got my handy dandy little notes here so I can try to keep my train of thought. You're going to keep me online and on task?
You give me your notes.
And so, what has been your experience with genetics and epigenetics? What would you like to impart to our crew of people?
I don't really know, honestly.
So, one of the big things that I wanted to get across was your genes are not your destiny. Genetics are a framework. And so, when you read a genetic code, or you do a genome sequencing, that is giving us basically traits and characteristics that can or might um, express themselves. And so they call that your phenotype. And so as I was sitting down and I was writing some notes, it's the first thing is what are your genetics? And so you got to think about a double helix, a DNA strand. I forget the letters AGCT. I think are that adenine, guanine, tyrosine, cysteine. I think those are the three in the or four in that make up the pairs. There is a wrapping, so think of it like a straw. There's a wrapping around the actual DNA. And the body knows what sections of DNA are wrong. And so, or coded wrong. And so it keeps a real tight wrap on those. And so when we're stressed, when we eat poorly, when whatever happens that allows those genetics to express themselves, that wrapping loosens up and then the DNA is allowed to express itself. And so if you look at that and you start to think about that, we can now do whole genome sequencing and we can look at certain areas and start to do things. So think about celiac disease, and celiac disease is a issue with the gut where you're very sensitive to gluten, and they know that if you have single nucleotide polymorphisms in the HLA genetics, as you can tell, she's real thrilled with the gene thing. When we look at that, if you have issues in the DL or the HLA DQ2 and DQ8 strands, then you are more predisposed to having celiac disease. Actually, to have celiac disease, you have to have the DQ8, DQ2 positive, and then that. Otherwise, you can't be a true celiac. You can be sensitive, but you're not a true celiac. So that's kind of the way it looks. And so if you look at your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, your brothers and your sisters that are older than you can start to see if you live the same lifestyle that they live, then you will have the same phenotype that they have. So if this person has, let's go worst case scenario and talk about like Alzheimer's and dementia. If you live the same lifestyle that they have, and especially if you pay attention to your mother and grandmother's genetics and issues, because we get our mitochondria from the females, from our mothers. If you look at those, then you can start to see, hey, if I live the same lifestyle they have, then I'll get the same diseases. But as I said, your genes are not your destiny. And where they have seen ground being gained in diseases like this, especially when you're looking at Alzheimer's and dementia and Parkinson's and stuff like that, you can actually start to get reversal and gain of function as you start to pay attention to things like, okay, what is my methylation status? Do I have holes in my methylation genes? So we can tell when you have problems in certain genes that, so think of a gene as a production factory. And what the gene does is the gene produces proteins. And proteins are your building blocks of everything. They're the building blocks of your enzymes, your hormones, you name it, it's made of proteins if it's in you. And so if you get a whole genome sequencing, you will start to see where there are holes in your genetics. And as we say in genetics, up to age 25, you are an expression of your genetics. After age 25, you're an expression of what you have done to your genetics. So if you don't pay attention after age 25, when the metabolism slows down naturally, the microbiome gets narrower, our hormones don't get produced as easily, these things all start to slow down. You have to actively be trying to support those systems. And so you can tell where you will have issues, and then you can be proactive about supporting those. And then you can start to reverse some chronic lifestyle diseases um, in the process. So if you take it, let's say you have a problem with methylation, so you're going to have a problem with B12, and everybody has heard about the MTHFR gene. So if you have issues with this, then you know that you need to have methylated B vitamins because your body doesn't actually produce these. Now the other thing is now we know that there are certain strands of bacteria that if you have present in your gut, you can help offset some of these things. So it's fascinating, fascinating work. So I've talked about the traits and characteristics. I talked about the unwrapping and expression. They produce the proteins, which are the building blocks of life. Blah, 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 blah. One thing that I like to tell people or talk to people, especially when we talk about chronic diseases and chronic diseases of, like, let's say, diabetes. When we talk about chronic diseases like diabetes, if you didn't have that when you were born, then most likely it's an acquired disease, and you can do a lot to, if not cure it and reverse it, to really control it. And we have seen that play out time and time and time again. So there are lots of things that if you develop these, there's a good chance you can undevelop these, especially if you pay attention. And like I said, we see it all the time. So, what influences the genetics? And this is something that I found fascinating that I learned a few years ago. The pathway is bidirectional. So, when I say that, I want to use the analogy of a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet. When somebody has a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet, you spike blood sugar really quickly. And the body then doesn't know what's going on. The body says, hey, why is my blood sugar spiking? Did I miss something? Are we running? Are we fleeing from something? Are we getting ready to fight? And that's when people start to become agitated, and they get really worked up. And then what happens is after 20 to 30 to 40 minutes, then all of a sudden they go through a crash. And so we call this a reflex hypoglycemic event. And that means that insulin basically is remaining too high. But your body doesn't know why why the blood sugar got high. And it was because of what you were eating. And that causes a stress, which puts your body in fight or flight. So that's why it's very important to not do that chronically over and over and over again. And that's why it's bidirectional. Because if you all of a sudden think that you're going to be shot and killed, or you need to run away from something, guess what? Your blood sugar raises. You get anxious and agitated. You get ready to run. You got all this energy, and then you go. And then what happens after the stimulus is gone? Well, then people have that crash. Am I forgetting anything there? Anything, Dad, yet? So that's the bidirectionality, especially when it comes to diet. And that's how diet affects that. The other thing about diet is you've got to make sure that you're getting enough fiber in to feed the bacteria that can fill any gaps in your genetics. So wherever you have SNPs, we now can see in research that there's almost for every SNP there's a bacteria that can be a resident in your gut that will help make up for that deficiency. And so it's super fascinating. So nutrition can affect your I gave myself a thumbs up. Nutrition can affect your genetics. Stress can affect your genetics. Lack of sleep. When you don't get good sleep, then that puts you into that fight or flight mode. And so then you want to eat crappy foods. Then you want to eat a high sugar diet. And then they can start to see what they call epigenetic changes in a lack of sleep for 2 days, 1 or 2 days. So sleep is very important for the genetics. What you think is very important. So if you're the type of person that is always negative, you have to remember that we are still animals as humans. And a lot of us, we're just this little frontal portion. The rest of that works pretty automatically. And the interesting thing about the rest of the body is it's like I'd like to think of it like a dog. And so if you beat your body up and it's always in the mode of survival, then it's never going to relax. It's never going to do the functions that make the body happy, healthy, pretty. It's not going to do that stuff. So if you're the type of person that is always negative, you really not need to start looking at. I don't say fake it till you make it. I say you need to start to look for the good in things. You need to give yourself hope, because if you're always in despair, the animal in you remembers the bad things, because that's what keeps you alive. And your gut, your reflexes, those are things to keep your body alive. And that's why when you get ready to walk into a dark room, there's ooh, wait a minute, is there something in here that could harm me? And that's that pit of your gut, and I think you call it your intuition. But those are the
You
things.
always should listen to your gut. Always.
But
Ask any good nurse.
there you go. And in that case, though, think about how stressful that is. Think about how stressed out you were as a nurse, because you're always worried about the worst thing that could happen to the patient.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that, but like your gut is like a sixth sense. I mean, I believe you, but your that intuition or sixth sense, that's for real.
And so it's there to keep you out of trouble. But realistically, if everything is going great, you can have that moment of, oh, wait a minute, but then you
Not
need to.
every dark room has a monster in it.
That's right, and rarely does a dark room have a monster in it. So what you think, what you eat, thoughts, foods, these are all things that affect genetic expression. And if you want to see something wild, just go into PubMed and type in nutrition and epigenetics, and you will see that food is one of the most controllable factors that you have to influence gene expression, along with controlling your thoughts. You know, you're not going to die all the time. And if your life is that stressful, you need to make a plan on how to change it. Let's see, ways to use your genetics. I wrote down functional genomics. So that's where I was talking about you can do whole genome sequencing. We do it for patients. We look at all their genetics. Do they get rid of free radicals easy? Do they methylate? Do they have problem with the HLA genetics? Those are the things that are a gross overview. And then there's a thing called IntelliDXX, which goes through and looks at all the research and compares all the research to all of the SNPs that you have. And it tells you where there are serious problems. And so I'm a perfect case in point for this. Our mother died at a relatively early age of an unbeknownst malady, which we're pretty sure she didn't have an autopsy, but she had an older brother die from an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and we're pretty sure she died from an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and two more of her brothers have abdominal aortic aneurysms. So when I heard all of this, I did my genetics, and then I went through and I did do an IntelliDXX on my genetics. And when I did that, I saw that I have the K2 SNP. So I supplement, and the K2 SNP is very or is specific for. I still remember the big red box flashed across the screen saying this KI 1099A SNP or gene is known for having problems with abdominal aortic aneurysms. And I was like, huh, I'll be darned. And so my brother's an anesthesiologist, and I went, hey, Trent, look at this. And he's like, oh, Jesus. He's like, what's that saying about what are we supposed to supplement with? So then we both started with 50 mics of K2 a day, and we told all of our relatives. And so everybody started these things. And that K2 high blood pressure runs in my family. Guess what's related to it? The 1099 K2 gene. So sometimes for maladies that we can't seem to iron out, running the IntelliDXX to look at the genetics and the research is a fascinating and sometimes a very helpful tool to use. So the functional genomics, looking at the pathway weaknesses, looking at the functional problems, and then looking at, okay, now that we know these things, use the genetics for what it's for. Start to supplement the SNPs, use either nutrition, or we will sometimes refer out to medical doctors, and we want to plug those holes, especially while you're trying to heal. And then other things like, hey, I don't methylate well. Hey, I shouldn't be eating gluten and wheat because I have the HLA SNPs. The dog is bumping my hand.
She gets excited. It's her birthday today.
It's her birthday. Sorry, we got to take a moment. It's her birthday. And anytime we turn on this machine, she'll lay on the floor all day long. But by golly, we sit down to do this. And here she is.
She's got to be a part of the 7 o'clock talk.
She's, I guess, the mascot. Um, and don't leave us yet because we do have an announcement. And last, yeah, avoid the problems and help the genes. And that way you can start to heal the bigger issues. And a bigger issue that is hitting close to home now is evidently Columbus is starting to have a
homeless issue. So we have a friend where she inadvertently found that there was like a homeless camp behind her home, and was quite vocal about it because there was schools around there. But not only did she call it out, but she also wants to be,
well, she's doing something about it.
Yeah, she wants to be a part of the solving that problem, or at least helping. And so if you're local, um, we would like to help. She wants to bring a dumpster in and help them clean up
Well,
the
we're
place
taking
because
care of that.
they're
But
on
there's
private
going,
property and they're trespassing and they've made a mess. So we're going to share. We're going to do what we can. But if you're local, follow the situation. I think they're going to have.
what's her name, and tell her where to look.
Um,
Tammy Watson, is it?
Tammy Watson. You can follow her on Facebook, or I think some of her things are public, but I think she's going to try to get a committee together, or at least hold, something to bring light to the issue, and not just bring light to the issue, but to try to get some help for those that want it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, everybody has issues. Everybody has times. When we were talking about genetics, this plays into it. She found out that there was somebody down there that was 22 years old that lost his mother, and he's now homeless, and he's trying to get going. But the way that this expresses itself genetically is the stress of it all will start to wear him down. It wears out the B vitamins, and then the body starts to break down. And so we see people all the time who, I didn't have diabetes until my mother died, or I got a divorce, or there was a car accident,
A lot
or
of autoimmune disorders are triggered by stress.
yeah. And so it's an interesting tie-in. But the other part of that is hey, some people choose to live and be homeless. They like the minimalist lifestyle, and tip of the hat to those people who are. But for those that don't choose that lifestyle, I am a very big believer in putting a hand out to help get them up. I am not a big believer in, hey, here's everything you need to survive. Don't try to help yourself. Um, there's any number of things. The Bible says, he helps them who help themselves and stuff like that. And you just feel good when you can help somebody else without expecting repayment. Because if you can do that and you're in the position to do that, it just makes you feel good. Every time I've ever helped somebody out when I didn't expect repayment and I could, it it's weird. I'll just look up and say thank you for being that, letting me be able to help. And there's a lot to that, even in genetics, because people who are hopeful and people who are thankful, that's why gratitude has a big play in calming people down and putting people into parasympathetic tone. Those things are very, very important, and they do affect the genetics, and they affect the genetics of both the receiver and the giver. So I went a little bit over time, but I honestly could talk about genetics forever and start pulling out the analyses of and getting into the little pathways. The biggest takeaways here, I would say, are what we see with most of our patients. Start some form of gratitude, either journaling or practice. Get away from the processed foods. If you didn't hear my example earlier of the blood sugar issue, go back and listen to it. It is a bi-directional thing. It's kind of like sometimes people say the only way to start to feel better about yourself is to go out and help somebody. But I don't feel like helping somebody. Well, sometimes you got to give before you get, but don't expect to get.
But don't be an enabler.
So, have a wonderful evening. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed the eclipse, and we'll see you next week.